In this segment, I'm going to briefly talk about how to create and carry out surveys. Here are some key prior concepts that are important to know. Number one, validity. Do your measures or proxies, in this case survey questions, match up with the underlying variables? Are your survey administration procedures reliable? And you have a representative sample. Dr. Mudassar has already talked about what it means to have a representative sample. Now, many MPhil students in their thesis proposal say, we're going to do a survey, and then they do it. But it's not always clear why they do it. So before you think about doing a survey, which is one research tool, you need to understand what your research goal is. What am I wanting to find out? What am I doing? Then your next step is to clarify your variables. People are very happy just to start asking questions, but I always ask them, what is the purpose of this particular question? What concept, what variable does it connect with? If your survey question does not connect with a particular variable, either an intervening, independent, dependent variable, that is important for your study, then you shouldn't be asking that question. And then you also need to think about what level of measurement is my variable, or do I want it to be, because you can construct questions in different kinds of ways. We'll talk about that a little bit more. To begin with, what are some key characteristics of a quote-unquote good survey? Number one, it should be easy to administer. It should not confuse people when they get it. Ideally, they should be able to fill it out themselves. Now, in the context of Pakistan, oftentimes when you carry out a survey, you get into communities with limited literacy rates, so you may have to fill it out for them. But even there, it should be easy to administer with clear questions and with as little explanation as necessary. As mentioned earlier, you should have valid measures. Your questions should represent the underlying variables or concepts well. They should be related. And each question should be related to some theoretical concept. There should be a purpose for it. And your survey administration procedures should be reliable. Of course, a large part of that is selecting your sample size and your sample, but also how do you plan on carrying out the survey? Where are you going to go? How are you going to enter the data? These are all important aspects that pertain to reliability. Now, when we construct our survey, we kind of imagine that the respondents are going to spend as much time answering the question and be as thoughtful in responding to it as we have in constructing it. We imagine optimizers who seek to understand the question's intention. They search their memories for useful information, for useful answers that will be relevant to that particular question. They'll evaluate the info and try to narrow down those experiences that will be relevant for the question. And we imagine that they'll take time answering those questions. But in reality, when we do surveys, there's a large chance that we will get satisficers and not optimizers. After all, the respondents did not start their day thinking or looking forward to answering a survey. In many cases, they are surprised by it. Sometimes one can warn people ahead of time, and then one might be more likely to get optimizers as opposed to satisficers. But typically, you get satisficers. They don't want to take a lot of time. They will answer questions with the most readily available info that pops into their brains. They'll look for cues or hints in questions that will help them answer more quickly without having to understand what the question really means. We'll talk about some of these biases that can come from the way we construct questions that can endanger reliability. And sometimes they give answers that are only loosely related to a question's intentions, partially because they have not read the question carefully enough. This is satisficing, and it is a danger to reliability. After all, what if all the answers are simply random? People have just clicked off the answers without thinking about the underlying meaning. Now, what are some conditions that encourage satisficing? Well, number one, the cognitive limitations of the respondent. They simply don't understand the questions. And obviously, parallel to that, the questions are too complex. So we need to make the questions as simple as possible, in layman's terms in particular. Lack of motivation of the respondent is also a major aspect of satisficing. This, again, as I mentioned before, the respondent probably did not start their day wanting to fill out a survey. They don't want to do it. And the lack of motivation can be exacerbated by the length of a survey. If you have a survey with 10 or 20 pages, a respondent might, well, first of all, decline to answer it. And secondly, if they do answer it, they'll just sort of rush through it, skip over some questions, not answer others properly. These are threats to reliability. And we need to make sure that we minimize these threats, and that there's some things we cannot control the cognitive limitations of our respondents, but we can make our questions as clear and simple as possible. We cannot control how motivated a respondent is, whether they had their coffee or chai in the morning, but we can control how long our survey is going to be. We should make it as short as possible given the constraints of our research. We should also be as clear and open about the purpose of our survey as possible when we start. By introducing our survey in an appropriate manner, we condition people as they're about to respond in such a way that they will answer, hopefully, in as meaningful a manner as possible. A cheerful survey taker will probably influence the respondent in a more positive way, where your attitude does make a difference. Now, when putting together a survey, there are some choices that we have. To begin with, should we have open-ended or closed-ended questions? Now, in qualitative, in-depth interviews, we always ask open-ended questions because we want detailed answers. But in quantitative survey questions, we want to have short answers that are to the point. Still, we can sometimes use open-ended questions. The advantage of open-ended questions is that we get more accurate and truthful answers, and we encourage the responders to give thoughtful responses and to avoid satisficing. With closed-ended questions, it may be easier to process data because we provide people with a limited set of options. On the other hand, it may not be as accurate as open-ended questions. If we provide them, for instance, with a list of political parties and ask them to choose, we may not actually give them the options that they want. On the other hand, we do exclude the possibility of someone writing a nonsense response and thereby making the data less valuable. Now, an additional choice that we have is between ranking and rating questions. Now, a ranking question in this example about political parties would be to give them a list of political parties, could be 5, could be 10, could be less or more, and to rank them according to their least and most favorite party. Now, the benefit of this is that you make the respondent think. You increase the chance that they're intentional, that they optimize and not satisfies. On the other hand, it is more difficult to quantify and compare the data that we get from these answers. Rating questions, continuing with this example, we would give them a particular political party and ask them in how far they approve or disapprove with that political party. Now, one can use different ratings. Most commonly is what we call a Likert scale, from most satisfying or approve the most to least satisfying or disapprove the most. One can have ratings that go from 1 to 7, 1 to 5, 1 to 10, 1 to 100 even. Most people argue that one should have a concept that lies behind the number. One shouldn't simply give respondents a number. One should give a meaning behind the number. Otherwise, it will encourage satisficing. But the benefits of rating is that it's easy to quantify and to compare data across different questions. Now, when putting together a survey, there are a number of problems or biases that can endanger reliability of our research results. The first one we're going to talk about is the acquiescence response bias. This is particularly a problem with Likert scale questions. So, for instance, in how far do you agree or disagree with the following statement? This is a type of question that I put in the online survey on a number of points. Now, their options would go from strongly agree to strongly disagree. Now, humans, and Canadians in particular, as you can see in the cartoon, humans want to be agreeable, particularly when they're not 100% sure about what their opinion is. The respondent will want to agree. What can we do? Well, we can't change the makeup of human psychology. What we could do is to give the disagree option first in order to increase the chances that the respondent will optimize and not satisfies, that they will think about the question. Now, another bias that can crop up in survey questionnaires and affect the reliability of results is what we call the response order effect. In other words, the order in which we put response options affects the responses that respondents give. We would like to think that they are optimizers and think carefully about each option, but in reality, they are satisficers. In visual surveys, typically what happens is what we call the primacy effect. The first option that a respondent sees is the one that they will pick more often, particularly if they don't have a strong opinion about the option. So here I have depicted this visually. Which adjective best describes Prime Minister Imran Khan is the example. And the one that will stick in people's mind is probably the first one. Hence the different font sizes, just to pictorially show this to you. What is the psychological effect? When it comes to audio surveys, which are often done in polling, particularly before elections, you get what we call the recency effect. In fact, the opposite. The option that is given last will stick in respondents' minds the most. So listen to this example. What do you think about Nawaz Sharif? Is he charismatic? Is he decisive? Is he corrupt? Or is he fearful? Now, for those who don't have a strong opinion, the one option that will stick in their mind is the last one, and probably that one would be fearful. An additional problem that can crop up and endanger the reliability of our research results is the question order effect. In other words, where I put my question in a survey can have an impact on the kinds of responses that respondents give. Now, a fairly famous example from a survey that was done during the Cold War time period is the one I've listed here. So, when respondents saw the question, should reporters from communist countries be allowed into the US? When they saw this question in the beginning of the survey, the number of respondents who said no was fairly large. If, however, this question came after another question, should American reporters be allowed to report from the Soviet Union? If that question preceded the question about reporters from communist countries being allowed into the US, then the percentage of people who said yes, reporters from communist countries should be allowed into the US was bigger. So we really need to pay attention which order we put the questions in our survey questionnaires. Some people try to randomize this and sort of try to make sure that there is no question order effect by randomly putting questions in different parts of the survey and not putting them together by theme. This can have additional problems, though. It might be too difficult for respondents to jump from one topic to another, and thereby it might increase satisficing. Nevertheless, the question order effect is an important one that should be taken into consideration. Another issue that we face when putting together a survey questionnaire is that of attitude recall. Research has shown that memory is notoriously unreliable. We have to remember that a survey takes a snapshot in time and it's not designed to research past attitudes or behavior over time. In fact, the only way you can do this is if you have done multiple surveys in the past. If you ask people about their past attitudes, they may or may not accurately remember what they thought. In fact, it's more likely that they project their present attitudes onto the past. So, for instance, the question, what did you think of Donald Trump in 2016? Well, 4 years might be a very long time. You might get people to remember accurately. But it could be that people remember that they had a positive attitude when in fact they didn't. Or vice versa, they may remember that they had a negative attitude, in fact, when it was positive. So we need to take care not to ask questions that a survey really can't gauge. The social desirability response bias is particularly important and relevant when it comes to politically controversial questions. If you ask people, are you a racist? Almost everyone is going to say no. Partially that's because they don't think of themselves as racist, because racism has such a negative connotation. But even if they were to regard themselves as racist, they will not be willing to admit it in an interview. Here, the identity of the survey taker may come into play as well, particularly if that survey taker's identity is obviously or clearly related to the nature of the question. So, how do we get around this? Well, oftentimes we have to ask questions indirectly in such a way that they no longer appear to be about things related to social acceptability or desirability. So, if you want to know in how far people are racist, you might ask them questions indirectly. For instance, in how far would you be willing to live in a neighborhood with a particular ethnic majority? Or in how far would you be willing for your children to marry someone from a different ethnicity? Even those are slightly direct. One can make it even more indirect. So this is a bias that one has to be aware of, and that's particularly important for political science questionnaires. Now this one is quite basic and I think intuitive to you all. But the key in political science research is that you avoid leading questions. You're not a political operative or working for a campaign. You're trying to get at an underlying political phenomenon. You're trying to get at the truth. So you shouldn't ask questions that push people in a particular direction. Now, before the 2016 elections in the US, uh, American citizens, and at the time I was there as well, were getting calls from various campaigns, in particular the Trump campaign. And a typical question would be, and how far do you agree that crooked Hillary is corrupt? Well, obviously that question is leading us to a particular answer already. Now, most questions, even in political campaigns, won't be that obvious. But we really need to be careful that we're not pushing people to respond in a particular way, but that we're constructing our question in a as neutral a way possible. When putting together your survey questionnaire, you should remember that your survey respondents are not experts. They shouldn't be testing your hypothesis for you. So when you're putting together your survey questions, you should always remember that you should only ask about one variable per question. In the example above, why do people support the PTI? Is it because of Imran Khan's charisma or because they're disgusted with previous parties' corruption in public office? You actually have three variables: support for PTI, opinions about Imran Khan's charisma, and disgust with previous parties' corruption. You should really construct three separate survey questions for that. Furthermore, survey questions should always ask about respondents' personal experience, behavior, or attitudes. You shouldn't ask them about abstract politics. They may have an opinion about it, but they have no special knowledge of it. What you're really trying to do is test in how far someone's attitude about one thing, political party, is related to someone's attitude about another thing. In this case, Imran Khan's charisma.